And we are live. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm joined by Simon Harris today to talk about, I'm not sure. I suppose we're talking about Falangism and Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera.
You've done well done, man. You've done it.
Yeah, you can kind of guide me through that. You can speak about it any way you want, really, because I'm just curious about the time period. So thanks for joining me anyway. And how would you like to kind of structure this? From your, I know I'm doing the interviewing, but actually, let's do it this way.
Just ask me a question. Ask me the first question. And then we'll see how it goes.
I was thinking about this for like the last little while, and I was like, how am I going to do this? Because I am on a zero level with, let's say, 1930s Spain, and I think a lot of people are. It's a big gap in our history books. I know about Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, the Japanese imperial situation, and Spain is just kind of this blank spot, and I don't know why. So I saw you were kind of prefacing an essay recently on Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera.
It's almost as difficult to pronounce as Garrett.
Oh yeah, nearly. But who was he, and his main? We'll go from there.
Well, actually, as you've raised it this way, let's start it this way. I'm sorry for. Okay, you've just said that you didn't know much about it. And probably the best question to start is why am I so interested in it? Why do I think this is so important? And then we can kind of get into who the person was. Well, okay, firstly, some background to me. I make my living publishing out of copyright texts as books. And I make takes a lot of work, but I don't actually have to write the book. This is why I really deep dive into researching topics. When I find an interesting topic, like my previous topic was the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, really research it in depth, come up with a completely new edition, and publish it. So I don't start from zero. And after I'd done the protocols, I really got into the Bolshevik Revolution, and I was kind of moving through a period in history. Now, to be out of copyright, you need to publish books that are the author has died over 70 years ago. So the next natural period of research was the nationalisms, for want of a better word, that arose in Europe immediately after the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution. And now, I was a little bit frightened of looking at Hitler and Mussolini. So then I looked at Oswald Mosley, because before deciding on what I'm going to do, I do a lot of reading around the subject, a lot of messing about, really. And so I read a lot of Mosley, very, very interesting. And I realized that everything I knew about Mosley, just in the same way as pretty much everything we know about, you've been told about Hitler and Mussolini. It's not that it's false, but it's not accurate. One has to view it in a very different way. And if anybody wants to, I really recommend on Hitler, for example, or the causes of the Second World War, I really recommend people subscribing to my good friend, the guy that does the live streams with me every Tuesday. He has a YouTube channel called Horus. And you ought to start with his video, The Infolding of the Right. And he'll explain to you the cause of the Second World War and the real story behind it. And you don't have to hero worship Hitler. What you have to do is just look at Hitler as a regular politician, a particularly charismatic one, with some interesting radical ideas, who was basically fighting for his own people. That's it. You don't have to become a Nazi. You just remove all the chutzpah.
It's just history. It's just history.
Yeah, it's history.
That's it.
Okay, and this has been a long route round to getting to Jose Antonio. So I read a lot of Mosley. Now, Mosley died in 1987, I think. That means I can't publish his stuff, but I wanted to find out about it. So, yeah, what you've been told about Mosley isn't true. And then I live in Spain, so I thought I'm going to look at Jose Antonio and see if all the falsehoods that I've found out about Hitler, Mussolini, and Mosley were also true of Jose Antonio. And obviously, it's easier to publish things if they're already written in English. And Jose Antonio evidently wrote in Spanish. Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera wrote in Spanish. And rooting around, I found a book called Anthology, which had been published in 1955 by Ediciones del Movimiento, which was the Francoist movement's publishing company. Now, I read through this and I thought, oh, this was last August. I think this is fantastic. I found this document. I can publish it. I can write an introduction. I know a bit about the Civil War. Fantastic. Yeah, I'm on an earner here. But unfortunately, I read through it and I started thinking about it. This is a piece of propaganda. They're not telling me the proper story. So I started rooting around a little bit more and rooting around in Spanish. The big advantage is I've lived here for 32 years, so my Spanish is pretty damn good. And I started researching in Spanish, and I found out that his complete works hadn't been published in Spanish since 1976, a year after Franco died. So I'd found out that the Franco regime had produced a piece of propaganda that just didn't ring true. And then in 1976, the democratic, in inverted commas, the transition government in Spain had effectively banned his complete works. And I've also found out since then that they burned all the copies they could find that were in existence, because they had been published by Ediciones del Movimiento, the Francoist publishing house, and they were all burned. Weird. So I started getting deeper into it. And okay, the other question you ask is, why is the period interesting? The Spanish Second Republic and the Spanish Civil War, why are they interesting? I'd already read quite a lot about this. They're interesting because they're the dress rehearsal for the Second World War. So all the sides line up to a certain extent. The forces of the left, the so-called or the nationalist forces. I don't want to get into word. I'll get into words like fascist and Falangist and National Socialist later, but on more distinct definitions. Now, in order to understand so much European history, you have to understand this period. I knew quite a lot about it already, but all of a sudden, I started looking at Jose Antonio, and I would say he is one of the most misrepresented historical figures you've ever come across. His story is completely far out because he was used as a propaganda figure by the Franco regime, which wasn't true. Franco could have saved him. He was executed by firing squad on the 20th of November 1936 by the Republicans. Franco had the chance to save him and could have exchanged him from Largo Caballero, who was the Republican prime minister. His son had been captured by the Republicans, and Franco could have saved his life, but didn't want to. They wanted him to turn him into a legendary, a myth. Yeah, and also, once he had been executed, Franco didn't tell the Falangists who were fighting on the nationalist side that he had been killed. It said they'd lost track of him and he was always coming back, and he was referred to as the absent one. So he was used as a propagandist figure during the Spanish Civil War. And in 1937, Franco took control of the Falange and changed its ethos by merging it with a traditionalist. You have to know a lot about Spanish history, but merged it with the traditionalist Carlists, who ideologically have nothing to do with it, and turned them into his own shock troops. And after the end of the Civil War, Manuel Herilla, who in about 1938 assumed Jose Antonio's role as the Falange leader, was put on trial and given the death sentence because the Falangists, the real Falangists, were so against the Franco regime. Right up until just before the Civil War started, Jose Antonio was saying, do not ally with anyone who isn't part of ideology. We're not on the right. We're Spanish idealists. And it was only the murder. It was in when was it? May 1936. No, June 1936, when Calvo Sotelo, the leader of the opposition, was assassinated by the Republican police, that everybody said, okay, if we don't form a counter-revolution, we're going to lose this. Largo Caballero, I'm sorry, there's so much information here, but Largo Caballero, the Republican prime minister, was receiving money from Stalin and described himself openly as the Spanish Lenin. These were evil MFs.
And that's
what I mean.
I kind of want to focus on that because I like I say, I have a very little understanding of it. So it's in a way, it's beneath where you're at in a sense. But for someone who basically didn't know any of this, what I'm curious about is the Spanish Civil War had kind of the Falangists and the communists. Most people know that much.
Well, no, the nationalists and the communists. Yeah.
Yeah, because
the nationalists and the Republicans.
Yeah. So you have those two sides, right? And they came about, one rose to power and the other, something about that, which we'll get to. But what was the, let's say, pre-existing order before the communist and the nationalist or sides came into kind of dispute? Was there a pre-existing kind of monarchy or order before the communist side kind of came to power? I'm probably speaking very basically in a sense, but you know, something came beforehand and then the ideological stuff got going.
I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, I want to tell you the story as amenably as possible. But the Spanish history is just like any country's history is fascinating. Yeah. Spain, in fact, was gearing up to a civil war as a result of, you know, far left infiltration and the separatisms. Perhaps one day you and I could do a stream talking about Irish identity and Catalan identity, which is another. I don't want to go there in this stream. But so the lefts and the separatists were growing in power, and I would say from the mid-late 1920s, they'd got captured by Judeo-Masonic power. Let's put it. I mean, this is another of my topics of interest. The protocols. You start looking at these things, and this did happen. And the interesting thing is, in 1923, things this is in the 20s. Things had got so violent that Miguel Primo de Rivera, who is José Antonio's father, was Captain General of the monarchy. He was Captain General of Catalonia. He was a much decorated general who'd fought in many battles, who'd fought in the Spanish colonies, and he'd come home and he'd been put in charge of Catalonia. Now, what the Catalan independence people will never tell you is there was so much violence on the streets of Catalonia against the capitalists, provoked by a certain tribal group, I would say, another topic for another day, that the Catalan government asked Miguel Primo de Rivera to help them out. So he staged a coup initially in Catalonia, got the rest of the army on his side and the king, and became the dictator of Spain. So there was a dictatorship in Spain from 1923 to 1931, when he resigned, a pretty much broken man. Now, José Antonio was his eldest son, so he lived very, very closely. José Antonio was born in 1903, so he was 20 years old and a law student in Madrid at the time of the coup. But he loved his father very deeply. His father was a kind of quite brutish, simple man, a kind of good times guy, but José Antonio adored him. José Antonio was an intellectual, a poet, such a man of very refined taste, even as a very, very young man. So he lived the dictatorship very, very closely. And I'm certain there's indications, but he and his father would have shared a lot of the political decisions. And if you read some of the text closely, and I at some point I intend to go back through the Dictatorship, you can kind of smell Jose Antonio's intelligence in some of the memos and writings that his father produced in the newspapers. So Jose Antonio had experience of government. Let's go. I'm sorry. Let's go back. What was your question again?
Well, no, you've kind of answered it. Actually, it's just.
What's the background?
It obviously we didn't just arrive at the 1930s. There was something that led to it. So you've actually answered that very, very well.
Okay, there's more to this. He resigned in 1930, quite a broken man, because the country he did loads of good stuff. He modernized Spain a great deal. People give him very little credit for that, but it was an education system, a telephone system. He started building the metro in Barcelona and Madrid, lots of important power systems, got electricity all around the country, built dams. So a dry country had water reserves. I mean, it was a very productive regime. But he resigned in 1930 and 6 weeks later died of diabetes in exile in Paris, a broken man. A short interim government came to power. And then this is what the leftists will never tell you. Then on April the 14th, 1931, there were some municipal elections, not general elections, because the interim governments had kind of fallen apart. They were just municipal elections. And out of a whole country, a very small proportion were counted just in the major cities. And I've also read reports and heard about reports that a lot of the votes were just hidden in the leftist. They were just stolen from the polling booths. But the left declared victory. And effectively, it was a leftist coup. The start of the Second Spanish Republic was a leftist coup because they were municipal elections, even the ones that were counted. The right won more votes, but the left won in the major cities, particularly in the Basque Country and Catalonia. And because the king, Alfonso XIII, didn't have very much character, he didn't abdicate, he just left the country. And his government kind of disappeared. They weren't of the caliber of Jose Antonio's father, so the left declared the Republic. It hadn't been voted in. The elections only occurred for the Republic in, I think it was October 1931. So they ruled under a coup government, a leftist coup government, for about 6 months. And they abolished all the constitutional changes that Jose Antonio's father had brought in. And in the first elections, there was this kind of revolutionary zeal in 1931. And for the first 2 years, the leftist parties, a leftist alliance, leftist Republican alliance, ruled. Massive persecutions of the right, what you'll very rarely read about. I mean, churches were burned and thousands of priests were murdered, but just taken out and shot, bayonets forced into parts of their body that I'll leave listeners to imagine. It was really, really brutal in lots and lots of places. So then in November 1933, there were a second set of elections and the right won massively. And Jose Antonio at this time, not as the Falange. The Falange had just been formed on October the 29th, 1933. About 2 weeks later, there were elections, and Jose Antonio stood for a monarchist coalition because he was very closely associated with politicians who had been members of his father's government, and they were monarchists, just they had a rubbish king. So he because of his surname, he got into parliament. Now he got a new party at this time, the Falange, and he was in parliament and he started to shake up the world, really.
And so you're saying just to backtrack, because there's a lot going on for me at the back.
Yeah, I'm sorry about this, listeners, but it's a very complicated story.
This is what I want, but I'm going to have to track back over it a little bit. So are you saying the right in I forget which year you mentioned, but the right won a certain set of elections, the most recent
Okay,
one?
in
1, 2 to 3.
1931, there was effectively a coup.
Yeah.
About 6 months later, and
Yeah.
I've not been. There were I can't remember the word they use. I'm translating from Spanish, but there were elections that constituted the parliament. So it did become constitution. It did become democratically elected. And about October 1931, the left won. They were in power for 2 years, and there were elections called the following November, and the right won massively. And so the left were reduced to about, out of 350 seats, I'm not sure whether it was 350 seats back then in the Spanish Congress, but they were reduced to about 25% of the vote. So the right came in very successfully.
It's because my pre-existing narrative on this was that, let's say, I've forgotten the distinction. We have communists and we have nationalists, or we have...
I would say Republicans, which is a broad group of Republicans, liberals, communists. Okay, once the Civil War starts, it becomes, the communists on the Republican side, the Stalinists, gained the upper hand, gained the kind of moral control. But during the Republic, it was a broad alliance of liberals, Republicans, the odd anarchist, and the odd socialists. Very few communists during the Republic. Effectively, the party that's in government in Spain now, they were very, very far left socialists. So they were almost communists, but they weren't really Russian controlled yet.
Right. And so on the other side, then you have, it's probably equally kind of incoherent. Like the nationalist side probably was made up of a few different, you have Catholics and you have this, and you could tell us actually what.
Yeah, okay. One of the big groups were the monarchists who wanted the restoration of the monarchy. Then there were what they're called is the traditionalists. And previously I mentioned the union that Franco made between another political group. There was another group, particularly based in around the Basque Country, of really, really far right-wing people who were called the Carlists, and they had a pretender to the throne, and they'd been fighting wars off and on in Spain. There were 3 Carlist wars throughout the 19th century, and they never went away. And they supported a pretender, a different family lineage to the throne. They thought these were the rightful monarchs, but they were kind of ridiculously right wing, and so there was that group. Then there were the Republicans. There was a group that called itself the Republicans that blew hot and cold, led by a guy called Alejandro Lerroux. He started off left wing and turned out right wing. So he went wherever the power was, and he called himself a Republican, and he joined the right after the second set of elections. And the Falange were a tiny group. Prior to the Civil War, they probably only had 2,000 members, but their political impact was and ideological impact was much greater than their numbers.
It kind of, I'm reminded when you describe the Republicans, liberals, a bit of communists, not quite so many of them and stuff. It sounds to me kind of like a French revolutionary, liberalism / with an element of like radical, violent communism, effectively.
That's a good analogy, actually.
Yeah. And so what I'm thinking is, so if, I don't know, the words are hard with this, left, right, nationalist, Republican, something like that. My narrative on it, my simplistic narrative was that let's say the communists or the Republicans were voted into power. They were very cruel. And then the right or the nationalists began a war with them or fought against them to overthrow them because they were cruel. But from what you're telling me, the latest election you've mentioned, the right were in power. So it's wrong that like the right engaged in a coup against the left, starting the Civil War. So where is that at?
Okay, so April the 14th, 1931. Let's call them left and right.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that'll be easy. And this is obviously a great simplification. April of 14th, 1931, the left gets important victories in certain areas of in the municipal elections and declare victory. The king gets scared and runs away, so the left take power of the whole country. They hadn't won the elections. But there's a period of kind of revolutionary zeal, and they do win the elections later on that year. They support the working class, but there's a kind of a lot of BS to the left, as there always is. So a lot of revolutionary promises are made, and not much is delivered. They turn a blind eye to the persecution, particularly of the church and priests, and former right-wing members. So one of the things that radicalizes Jose Antonio is the continual persecution he receives from the police, even before he's formed the Falange. He doesn't form the Falange until just before the elections in 1933. But just because of his surname, he's in and out of prison. He's getting arrested for different things. The right were being clamped down on. There's an important moment during this period. He's a young lawyer where he actually defends. They put on trial all the members of his father's former government. Now, these people were just politicians. And one of Jose Antonio's radicalizing moments is leading the defense of former politicians who as was his father's eldest son. They weren't just politicians to him; they were family friends. There's a politician who's the very famous case. I forget the name of the politician, but when he was young, they had dinner together. This was much more an attack on the politics. It was an attack on the class. It was an attack on a way of life. It was an attack on a way of being. And people still talk about two Spains. This division is very, very profound.
I want to get into that in a second, where it lies now. But I was
just
kind of cutting across you.
Yeah. Okay. And then in 1933, there's a new set of elections in the right wing. This is called the Black Biennial by all left wing writers, but it doesn't really seem like that. In fact, throughout these two years, Jose Antonio is complaining continually about what a bunch of damp squibs this so-called right-wing government is. Now, then in February 1936, there's another set of elections, and there'd been so much disunity amongst the right that they didn't manage to get it together to form a coalition. The only way you could win, separate parties couldn't win. You had to have a right-wing coalition and a left-wing coalition. The right never managed to get a decent coalition together, but the left did, and this was the Popular Front, which everybody will have heard of. Now, the Popular Front, the Popular Front, the Republicans, socialists, more communists now, won the elections and formed a government. And this time, the persecution was much greater. Jose Antonio was put in prison on trumped-up charges at the beginning of March 1936. For those 6 months, the left ruled, and it was becoming increasingly radicalized, and the persecution levels just went up 500%. Even so, throughout all this period, Jose Antonio from prison was telling the Falange, whose numbers were growing, because the youth movements of the relatively right-wing Action Popular saw that they were out of power, so started joining the Falange in droves. Before these elections, there were probably 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 Falange members, let's say. It went up to about 35, 40,000 within a month, because people suddenly saw the Falange as the strong alternative to the left. So the two sides were polarizing radically. Even so, from prison, Jose Antonio was the indisputable leader of the Falange. Nobody else could lead it. He was highly charismatic. He was saying, don't ally with anybody. We are ideologically superior. These people are right-wing authoritarians, and they will produce a rubbish Spain. We don't want a right-wing Spain or a left-wing Spain. We want a Falangist. Basically, it's a fascism of a Spanish style, but it's a kind of sweet, intellectual, sentimental fascism. Stanley G. Payne, the great Hispanicist scholar, American Hispanicist scholar, written more than 20 books. If you want to read a book about Spain, Stanley G. Payne is your man, folks. Described Jose Antonio as everybody's favorite fascist. He's a great writer, a great historian. Jose Antonio was saying, lay off, lay off. He'd approached Franco, he'd approached the various leaders, he wrote letters to them. He was interesting. He basically said to Franco, yeah, you shouldn't, the counter or the counter coup shouldn't occur unless it's under my leadership. Because I'm a politician. You're a soldier. This is a slight oversimplification, but this is the message he was sending out. Now, it's only when Calvo Sotelo, who was the leader of the opposition in the Spanish Congress, got murdered by the Republican police, by the left-wing police. He actually said to his wife, they arrested him, they came to his house and arrested him, and it was very typical that the police would come to your house and take you for a walk. And there's a quote from his wife, who was interviewed later, who describes very graphically how he put his coat and jacket on. They'd just gone to bed. He got dressed, and his wife said, "How long will you be?" And it was a trumped-up charge. He had to go down to the station to, I can't remember what it was exactly. And he said, "I should be back in a couple of hours unless they take me for a walk." They took him for a walk. Now, you imagine the leader of the opposition getting murdered by the police. You know, this is heavy stuff. And it's at that point where Franco never wanted to lead an uprising. Franco obeyed orders, but it's at this point, there were other generals, General Mola, for example, who definitely wanted. There were people pushing for it, but Franco didn't want to. Jose Antonio didn't want to. Neither of them liked each other. They wanted to find a democratic route to solve this problem, both of them. But the murder of Calvo Sotelo, they thought, and with the increasing activism of Russia, the obvious support of Russia behind the Spanish Republican government, they thought the only thing we can do now is save the country. And neither Franco nor Jose Antonio wanted to stage a coup. And Franco certainly wasn't the leader. Franco was flown in from the Canary Islands. He'd been posted away from central Spain to keep him out of trouble because he was the star general. But he wasn't the star conspirator. It was only after a couple of months of the Civil War where Franco, being Franco, showed that he was the best general, and ended up being commander-in-chief. The stories people you read or people assume to be true are generally false.
And so we're right now, we are insofar as you're telling us the story here, we are in the Civil War, or you've just kind of set it up. The Civil War begins, and of course history, like any war or like any historical event, sometimes it has a start and end date in a history book, but obviously at the time it's probably a little bit more blurry. Is there a point at which the war officially breaks out?
Yeah, I'm going to embarrass myself now for not remembering the correct date, but I think it's July the 16th, 1936. Basically, Franco, it was General Mola who was called the director. He was nicknamed the director. There were various generals, Capo de Llano, Sanjurjo. Franco was flown in actually by a British. They rented a British plane to fly to the Canary Islands to get Franco. Franco sent a message to his former troops in Morocco to come over the Straits, and Franco was flown into Spain by a British pilot who, once again, this is my particular topic of study at the moment is Jose Antonio. So I know what I'm explaining to you are the kind of side issues. But Franco was flown back into Spain because he was a key general. And on the night of, I think it's the 16th of July, it was there were coordinators attacks on various parts of Spain. They failed in Madrid. It failed in Barcelona. It was General Godet in Barcelona who was the Captain General in Mallorca. He came over that night. So everybody, all the important military leaders came in and led their troops that night in Barcelona. A lot of the military just refused to follow Godet, and the left-wing forces were very well organized in Barcelona, so it failed very quickly. I don't actually know quite as much about Madrid because one of my previous topics of study has been Catalonia, which is where I live. So I know a lot about the precise events of those few days in Catalonia, but not quite so much in Madrid. But it failed in those two key cities. But in large parts of the countryside, it was successful. So, and after a couple of weeks, it was very clear the generals had expected to take Spain, in a few hours, like a shock coup. That didn't occur. And so after a few weeks, it was very clear that it had to be a civil war. That there was 50-50 the country, really.
So that's where it was at. And the battle lines are kind of drawn there. Certain parts of the country are geographically held by one side and another. Classic civil war, basically. And I'm almost showing, this will show you my historical ignorance on Spain. I did tell you, I forewarned you about this. I'm not even fully sure who won. Franco won out in the end, didn't he?
Yeah. Franco declared victory on April the 1st, 1939, after nearly 3 years of civil war and, a lot of bloodletting. Okay, let's face it, by both sides. It was a civil war. It wasn't nice.
And that kind of was that. Now, to backtrack slightly, the foreign influence. I don't think any war in kind of maybe 20th century history is as shall we say diverse as the Spanish Civil War. I could be wrong there, but you hear Ireland has tales of blue shirts going over to fight for the shall we say the right, and communists, idealists, whatever, going to fight with the left. So you had that kind of like whatever the word would be, informal volunteering from citizens from all countries. But officially speaking, obviously you have Germany. Hitler is doing his thing during the 30s. Italy, Soviet Union. What's going on there with international involvement?
Well, it's basically Italy and Germany take the nationalist side and provide logistical support. Italy, particularly on the Mediterranean coast, mainly air force backup, and the Russian Communist Party provide massive amounts of armaments and quite a lot of on the ground troops or military advisors, I suppose you would call them, particularly in Barcelona. There's lots of interesting stories about Barcelona. In many respects, one of the reasons why the Republicans lost is there was a lot of infighting. People might have heard of George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. George Orwell came and you were talking about the informal support. There were the international brigades who fought on the side of the Republicans, and there were various idealists. I think that's the good word to call them. Lots of Irish patriots fought on the side of the nationalists. Now, a lot of the Republicans were sincere revolutionaries, and particularly in Barcelona, what the story that the interesting part of the story that George Orwell tells is the internecine fighting between left-wing idealists who wanted the revolution and then to win the war and wanted a egalitarian society, and the bitter, cynical Stalinists who couldn't give a two hoots about socialism or the revolution. They just wanted to win the war because it was a power war. And there's on the Ramblas. I occasionally give history tours of Barcelona, and it's a part that I do on the Ramblas is showing people where Orwell and his mates at the top of the what's now a theatre. They stayed at the top of the theatre fighting against the Stalinists, and these were all Spaniards and Catalans mainly. They were, but members of different parties. So they're fighting amongst themselves, and for a large part of 1937, the Republican forces weren't united. Finally, the Stalinists came out on top, but a lot of the left-wing idealists didn't want this kind of. They were real revolutionaries. They didn't want this kind of revolution happening in Spain, and when they saw that it was a power grab, pushed against it, and that's one of the reasons that obviously weakened the Republican forces internally.
That's interesting. It sounds like the logic of the war as it played out moved in favor of the nationalists, because as I'm just imagining, as time went on and it became a purity spiraling kind of shit show on the left with this, Stalinist Russia behind it, as the tiredness of war goes on, people just kind of, I imagine on both sides, start to feel like this is our country and there's this massive war being fought on top of it, in a sense, maybe. And people just get jaded of war itself. And if you're in that position by the end of it, do you fancy, if you want to just kind of end this thing, is it cleaner to go with Franco or to go with what will be a who knows what communist revolution?
Okay, I can speak very, very confidently of Catalonia. Now, the Republicans hated Franco. They didn't like the communists, but they certainly didn't surrender, and they fought tooth and nail.
Oh, really?
Up until the end. And what I'm telling you now, the fact that once again, I'm trying to give a non-partisan view of what happened in the Civil War. I've become a Jose Antonio fan. I'm not a Franco fan. I'm a Jose Antonio fan. And as many people, the people that don't know me, I used to be until a few years ago what I describe as a default leftist. So I believe the propaganda that the Republicans were the good guys. This is what's changed in my thinking now is I just see them as two sides fighting for a battle. However, I do see Jose Antonio as an exceptional idealist who, had he lived, would have changed the history of Europe. Had Jose Antonio become the president with military backing, the president of Spain. Franco later tried to ally with Hitler and Mussolini, and Franco wasn't a fascist. Franco was a right-wing authoritarian. He was a general. He was too stupid he was a very skilled soldier, but he wasn't a politician. This was Jose Antonio's argument always. You people aren't intelligent enough to lead a country. That you need to have morals. Jose Antonio was an intellectual. He was a brave intellectual who's prepared to die for his ideas. He would roll up his sleeves and get into fights. So he was no Nancy boy, but he had a very, very fine mind and firmly believed in a particular kind of future for Spain. And it was neither left nor right. It was third position. And had Jose Antonio become the leader of Spain, then both Hitler and Mussolini would have allied with Spain. The Allies wouldn't. Our forces with Spain added to Italy and Germany. Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler would have won. I'm convinced.
So the obvious thing you're pointing at there is that Spain did not join the war under Franco. I suppose I know that much, right?
Yeah.
For various reasons. But So looking at World War II as a whole, coming in at the end of the Spanish Civil War, or just kind of after it, you've explained like the Soviet Union on one side, Hitler, and Italy on the other. What's my point? It's just that World War II, classically to me, seems like it was destined to be a battle or a showdown between communism and fascism, the states representing both of those kind of ideologies. And the quirk of history, or well, actually, I'm sure you wouldn't call it just a random quirk of history, but the liberal world, the Western Anglo kind of world, jumped in and disrupted that war effectively and ended it on one side. So where in the Spanish Civil War did the US and the UK stand?
Neutral, well, more personally, actually, the Britain and France.
France as well. Yeah.
The US wasn't a player here, really. It wasn't a player until Britain got involved in a war. Although some Americans did, idealistic Americans came over and fought. Hemingway was in Spain throughout the Civil War, for example, and there were American journalists who tended to be pro-Republican, as journalists were lefties back then, just as they are now. Sorry, what was the question? There's so much running around my mind.
No, it's all good. It's let's say Britain and France, the liberal powers. Yeah.
Okay, they were. Yes, they were more than nominally. They didn't get involved. They allowed it to play out. So here it really was Italy and Germany against Russia, and Italy and Germany won in Spain. Now, had it been Italy, Germany, and Spain against Russia, would Britain and France come in on Russia's side with the odds much more stacked against them in 1939? I mean, I'm just wondering what would have happened.
So you've said this twice now. So you think Spain could have tipped the balance?
Yes, I think so.
Well,
because Hitler, okay, Mussolini was very close to Jose Antonio was funded to a certain extent by Mussolini from 1935 onwards, and admired him much more than he admired Hitler. Franco visited Hitler in 1940, I think. Hitler wasn't impressed. I think Franco was much more interested in allying with Mussolini and Hitler, Germany and Italy, than Germany and Italy were in having Franco. And throughout until 1945, Spain appeared to be a fascist regime because Franco adopted all the Falangist regalia. It was a military dictatorship with not very much ideology, but it was the Falangist song, it was the Falangist symbols, the Falangist uniforms, the Falangist trades union structure were all adopted by the new state because Franco wanted to look as fascist as possible, because he wanted I'm simplifying and extrapolating a great deal here. I'm going to get people in the comments saying what a bullshitter you are, Simon. But I'm trying to put across the story in the simplest terms possible.
Of course,
because this is already complicated as it is.
Yeah, you're explaining it to me, so you have to do that, right? I'd get lost. And it's good in a way too, as much as people might purity spiral on you on the like finer points. It's just we don't have 10 hours to go over this. So you have to be kind of a bit brief on it, which might lose a bit of nuance. So I think people understand that. But that's all very interesting. Though its connection to World War II as almost like a Promethean kind of thing is just very interesting. And your take on how it influenced the Second World War, or could have, I'm interested in. So there's this line that Bolsheviks or communists use a lot of, like, I don't know how it goes, fascism is the last resort for the capitalist class or something like that, right? How does that fit into the Falangist movement in Spain? Were they accused of that because of the relationship between Jose Antonio and his father, the monarch, kind of old order, maybe you could say capitalist regime? Does that accusation float about?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why people. I mean, okay, so his father was establishment. Let's call him establishment.
Sure.
No, Falangism is definitely third position. So, I mean, okay, the interesting thing about Jose Antonio is he managed to piss off all sides as a political opponent. So the socialists thought he was right wing. The right thought, the conservatives and monarchists thought he was left wing. He upset politically. He upset the apple cart for everybody. The interesting thing is, without exception, virtually everybody thought he was a wonderful person. Everybody loved Jose Antonio. You won't see. In fact, because apart from Franco actually, but this was a power grab. Because Jose Antonio knew that his writings would be disappeared by the regime, when he was in prison in the week before he was executed, he gave all his personal writings and papers to probably the second in command of the Socialist Party, who came to visit him in prison, Indalecio Prieto, who, as soon as the Civil War, who kept them in Spain throughout the years of the Civil War, but as soon as the Civil War finished, fled in exile to Mexico and didn't return these papers to Spain until after Franco had died, because he knew what Franco would do with them. Once again, I'm adding my own comments to the story. But why didn't he? He wouldn't. The family wanted these papers. They belonged to the family under Franco. Particularly Jose Antonio's sister Pilar was very closely associated with the Francoist regime, a very loyal Francoist. But Indalecio Prieto, out of love for Jose Antonio, didn't return them until after the death of Franco. And it's really only from 1996 that we get an accurate version of the complete works of Jose Antonio, which exist. In fact, look what Simon's got. This is I bought these. It was quite.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. This is the Jose complete works of Jose. Can you see them? Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah. They look like nice books actually. Nice, clean.
Yeah. Okay. I bought these from the Falange itself. When the Latin American guy that delivered them to me just kind of looked at me very weirdly. It's like, this guy is getting big packages from the Falange. He must be a very dangerous character. No, I'm a revisionist historian who wants to find out the truth, mate.
Yeah, that's all it is. Yeah.
It wasn't until 1996 that Jose Antonio's nephew published these papers as a separate book. And then in 2003, a group was formed called Plataforma 2003 to celebrate 100 years of Jose Antonio's birth and republish his complete works, but almost clandestinely, because they're not on Amazon. The only way you can get them is going to the Falange website, which still exists, and ordering them online. That's the only way. That you won't find them in a bookshop. So he's basically been memory holed.
Yeah, that's it. To me, the story of Jose Antonio described by you sounds just like a tragedy. This kind of could have been figure who was just kind of, he killed at the start of the Civil War, if I'm not mistaken. So, and there's a lot of what could have been there, it sounds like. So my final question really is to bring us up. So we started with his father, how it all began. And I suppose I want to end on you have Franco after the Civil War, has this fascist or whatever you want to call it regime, or as you described it, it kind of had the trappings of Falangism at the very least. And that was then, and this is now. it could be a very long answer. So I mean it in kind of in a nutshell, insofar as you can. What happened between? How did we get from there to whatever it is like now? And then finally, how do Spanish people these days view Falangism, and where are people now? Because I know people have their opinions these days in modern Spain. What's occurred since?
Since Franco died.
Well, how did it go from? Actually, no, that is too big a question.
It's just much too big a question.
It is. I'm conscious.
I'll come back for an hour every week for the next 6 months, I think, to answer that question.
It wouldn't be enough, but I mean, it just obviously Spain transitioned into a more centrist European style, like liberal country. So let's skip straight to the second part of that question. How do Spanish people view the whole thing now? Obviously, there are different opinions going around, but it's not seen like the Nazi regime in Germany. The way that's viewed in Germany now, obviously, we know the way that is. It's completely verboten and extremely dangerous of a subject. In Italy, I'm told it's a bit less so. It's a bit softer. What's it like in Spain to look back on that period of history?
Okay, the left are doing their as much as they can to demonize all these figures. I mean, amongst my friends, if I can't tell my friends, if any of my Catalan friends find out see this video and find out I'm researching Jose Antonio honestly, I mention it to a friend of mine, basically because it's a book project, and you know, I have to make a living. I'm at the moment I'm publishing in Spanish in 5 volumes. I've got the 2 volumes here, the complete works of Jose Antonio, with short about every 20 articles or speeches. I write a kind of synopsis of what's happened historically and biographically. So it's then the books I've showed you are just the complete works with no explanation. This is a kind of idiot's guide to Jose Antonio's complete works, if you know what I mean, but in Spanish, and it's in 5 volumes. Each volume is going to be about 400 pages. That's one project. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm translating, I would say there'll be 40, perhaps 45 of his most significant speeches or articles that I think define his ideology. We haven't really spoken about the ideology yet, and we won't today. There's too much. I'm just telling you the story. Once again, with quite long descriptions of what this speech says, what it's important, how it fits into the historical events of the time, and the power movements within the Falange. Because, you know, this Spanish version of fascism, there are lots of characters involved, not just Jose Antonio. Jose Antonio has to be the leader, but there's lots of interesting stuff there. So what I'm doing is I'm doing original research, and I'm a historian and someone who makes a living doing this, and this will be a very original piece, I think, when it's finished in about a year or so. But if I tell my friends, they're completely shocked. I mentioned the project to a friend of mine, a leftist friend of mine, who's an art dealer, and he just looked at me across the table as if I had suddenly turned into the devil.
Wow.
And so the left are really, but the thing is, they hate the image of Jose Antonio that the Franco regime created. They don't know who Jose Antonio was, because Franco always used him as a propaganda symbol. So in the Valley of the Fallen, where Franco used to be buried, there's lots of nationalists are buried there. It's a place just outside Madrid that was built in the 1950s. But the 2 great tombs, the 2 great heroes of the regime, were Franco and Jose Antonio. But the Jose Antonio that they sold to the Spanish people wasn't the real Jose Antonio. So when people get angry about me for admiring Jose Antonio, they're angry at me for admiring an invention. It's not the real thing. Okay, second part of the complicated question. Yes, the left are demonizing everything. The left rewrite history in a yes. I've told you that the right, Franco, propagandized things, but not to quite the same extent as the left do. I don't know if people will have seen in the news, but Franco was recently exhumed from his grave in the Valley of the Fallen, and he was moved to a kind of little family plot in a cemetery just outside Madrid. So they can stop. This is the way to stop, because on his birthday, on the anniversary of his death, on various important moments, right wingers, Francoists, used to go to the Valley of the Fallen to celebrate this. There's also a law in Spain called the law of historical memory, which basically is that if it's right wing, if it's got anything to do with Francoism or the nationalist side throughout the Civil War, that's murder, and all the Republicans are heroes. So any street that was ever named after anybody right wing throughout that period is removed, and a revolutionary Spanish left winger is put in his name. And basically the current government are bringing in laws, or this law is rewriting history. You're a hero if you're a Republican. If your grandfather was a Republican, your family gets money, you're a hero. You get his name, gets a street sign. If he was a nationalist, you have to be ashamed. In very much, it's obviously not demonized internationally in much the same way as the National Socialists, but it's similar. They want to demonize the right, and there are plans to bring in a law to make it a crime to be a Francoist apologist. So using any of the symbols associated with Francoism or Falangism is going to be certainly finable, possibly a prison offence here in Spain, as soon as these people, I was going to use an expletive, but the more I research these things and the more evil tactics I see the left performing, I mean, they're not prepared for the truth to come out, and they're not prepared for people to hold these opinions. But as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, this is kind of typical leftist repression. But I did mention the existence of two Spains. Now, these two Spains haven't really gone away. There are still people. There's still an authentic Falange. There are still Falangists. Certain members of the Vox Party, the second in command, Javier Ortega Smith, quotes Jose Antonio continually. He's my favorite of the lot. Brilliant. And very, very interesting, because I've been doing my research on YouTube. I've come to realize there's still, a fascist, for want of a better word, television station. There are people like Carlos Herrera or Federico Jimenez Santos, who are well-known radio presenters. This is radical. This isn't cooked conservatism. This is far right. These people tend to be older, and the younger generation have been really brainwashed by left liberalism, but it's happened very fast. So this older generation certainly aren't dead, and they're trying to close it down as quick as possible. And people will celebrate Jose Antonio's birthday, and people will celebrate Franco's death. And the recent rise of Vox a year ago, I don't know if you know that I recently debated Nick Griffin on my channel. This has caused quite a lot of furore, and there's a lot of comeback from this. But Nick was saying there's no chance for electoral route. A year ago, Vox had no political representation whatsoever. A few councils, probably. I think it was February last year, they stood in the Andalusian regional elections and got 10 regional MPs onto the Andalusian Assembly. And the only way the two other right-wing parties, Partido Popular and Ciudadanos, could form a government was with their help. In the last elections, that Spain has had a hung parliament a lot over the last year. In the last elections, Vox got to the Spanish Congress. I think once again it was 10 seats. And that was in April. So in February, March, they got 10 seats in a regional election, then 10 seats in the Spanish Parliament. Then it was a hung parliament, so the elections had to be repeated, and they were repeated in November this year. And Vox got 52 seats. So the nationalist movement, and I don't want to go into the kosher elements. We don't want to get into the JQ really. I think a lot of these parties, I'm a much more balanced about the Jewish question than I used to be. Sorry, I've been drinking beer this afternoon.
It's all good.
I think a lot of political parties have to pay lip service to Israel. I'm not sure how kosher cooked they really are. And particularly when I listen to somebody like Javier Ortega Smith, this guy knows his history. This guy is reading the right things. This guy is a third positionist. It's very you don't have to be anti, but these people, there are definitely people in the party who are real Spanish nationalists. I trust them completely. They're fighting for the good of their country. Within a large party, you're going to get all sorts. But I think that Vox are a net positive, really. I know
good.
I've gone off the question now. But
no.
Yeah, Franco and Jose Antonio demonized. But the existence of these two Spains means there's a groundswell of people who are unashamedly nationalists in Spain that hasn't gone away, because the brainwashing really, it's only, when I got here in 1988, it was so refreshing to see how politically incorrect they were. They used to talk to your face, and they talk about, Africans and gays and women. The idea that any Spanish woman would ever be a feminist back in 88 was completely absurd. So this kick into the kind of SJW liberalism has only really occurred since the mid-90s. I began to notice things in the mid-90s, and I suppose I was living away from the UK, so I remained a default lefty. I never broke out of the cage, but I was beginning to think, that's weird. I don't agree with that. And finally, the barrier came down for me, and I became, what I am now. I'm kind of, my thinking is third position, neither right nor left works, and I'm a nationalist, and I want to defend our people, be they Spanish and Catalan, English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, and French, and German, and Italian, because I think the plurality of our cultures, our marvelous cultures, needs to be preserved, and we're kind of being turned into some kind of muddy brown, indistinguishable thing that is just uninteresting.
I can relate to that. I've never been to Spain, and to imagine,
I'm a great cook, actually.
I'm looking forward to it. And the last time we talked, you mentioned a certain kind of festival or something like that. So we have that plan made already, but loosely. So I don't know. I would like to go to a Spain that feels Spanish, and hopefully, like you say with Vox, that kind of a Falangist kind of. I imagine there's a bit of nudging and winking and kind of going on, because they can't be too outright, and you have to read between the lines. If it's anything like politics I'm familiar with, you see a guy. It's basically like recognizing someone as our guy. You kind of notice the little, like you said, quotes they use and stuff like that. But if that can catch on and become a little bit cool again for some of the younger people, who knows what could happen? I think we've done a lot there. We could have talked about Jose Antonio's actual ideology, maybe a different time. Loads more, but I'm delighted. I can now say I know the bones of what happened with the Spanish Civil War.
Mm.
before we started, I didn't even know who won. So thanks for that.
Well, that's something anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pleasure to come on. I'm always interested. This is kind of my specific research topic. I suppose in our circles, I'm better known for speaking about general British and European politics, but I'm a bit of a nerd, really, and I kind of like to do really deep dives on things. And this is what I'm into at the moment. And if anybody goes on my channel is Simon Harris. You'll see between the European Freedom live stream that we do every Tuesday, which is kind of general stuff, I'm slowly publishing videos of these speeches that I'm translating. If I have a good week, I'll publish 2 15-20-minute videos where I give you some background, read you the speech, and just kind of chat about things, really. If I have a good week, I do 2, but normally it's 1 because I'm kind of busy getting myself into trouble doing other things.
Fair enough. I have you linked, your details linked in the description anyway, so people can go check out Simon's channel and Twitter and everything else, so you can follow all of this work that's been done. So thanks for joining me. I'll leave it there. Everybody subscribe to me as well and share this and all of that. So thanks very much, Simon. See you.